Hello there and welcome to the first of three presentations in this series called Emerging Pieces in the COVID-19 Puzzle, with myself, Rob Thomas, as your host, in conversation with Dr. Christine Houghton. Now, Dr. Houghton is a nutritional biochemist. She's a research scientist and an educator in the science of nutrigenomics. Christine is also the Director and Chief Scientific Officer for the company CellLogic. On that note, I'd like to welcome you, Christine.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's a pleasure to be part of this series.
Yeah, very good. Now, Christine, I know we've chatted about this quite a bit, but there seems to be a lot of confusion out there with COVID-19 centre stage and a lot of claims being made about specific, single nutrients, vitamins, herbs, ozone therapy, you name it. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm quite concerned about it, really, Robert, because this concept of using a single nutrient, a vitamin, to intervene in the most intricate of cellular processes is just too much to expect of any vitamin. A vitamin, by definition, is just an essential substance that comes from food, and it's a given that all vitamins must be present at any time for a cell to function at its peak. So the idea of giving mega doses of a single vitamin with a view to trying to intervene in this extremely complex process really just defies the science. So my view has been, over the last few months as we've been watching this story evolve, is to say, let's have a look at the mechanisms that this virus uses to get into the cell, what it does when it gets there, what sort of damage is it causing, and more importantly, what does the human cell do to mount a challenge against it? Because clearly humans have existed on this planet for who knows how many thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and we've been able to survive viral attacks. Not everybody, some of them, like the 1918 pandemic, killed enormous numbers of people across the planet, but there are those who survive it. And so nature does have inbuilt mechanisms that it can use to defend itself against such threats as a virus. The other thing that's most interesting, I find, is where nature's concerned, it doesn't really matter whether it's the coronavirus or some bacterium, some parasite, some fungus, some other organism that attacks. The human immune system is equipped to handle those threats, and it has many ways of bouncing back. So my goal has been to understand what the virus, this particular virus, does and how the immune system mounts that challenge. And we come up with a totally different picture of trying to use large doses of individual vitamins like vitamin C, A, zinc, selenium, a few other nutrients are being recommended, D, of course. But these are vitamins, and as I mentioned, they're essential. They have to be there anyway, and I'm assuming that we are replete with those vitamins, and we're actually looking for specific mechanisms to deal with such threats.
I love that, and particularly because our body has all those beautiful built-in mechanisms, and as clinicians, I see that as our challenge, that we were able to help harness those and build those mechanisms so that the body's able to overcome these challenges. So what are the steps in that process of the immune system, Christine?
Well, first of all, the body has to recognise that there's some sort of a threat. So it has particular ways of realising there's a threat, and there are sensor molecules that are like little antennae, I guess, that are detecting when a threat's present. So there's that aspect of cellular defence which recognises a threat. At that stage, the body doesn't know what the threat is. It just says there's something here attacking us and we better get ready. Step one. Now, step two is the immune system identifies the nature of that threat. It doesn't know it's this particular SARS-2 coronavirus, but it does know that it's a virus. So it says, okay, those of our defense system who deal with viral infections, get ready, you're going to have to work pretty hard. So it then has identified the virus. Then the relevant steps within the immune system, really, it's like the military. They sort of mobilize all of their defenses, all the cellular defenses, all the immune defenses are all mobilized, and the immune system is in attack mode. And that attack mode involves producing a lot of highly toxic molecules that are determined to be toxic to the virus. Now, there'll be a little bit of collateral damage on our own cells, but most importantly, the immune system has to deal with that virus. Now, part of that response is we create a lot of inflammation that can cause fever, which you all identify. If anyone's had the flu, they know you get feverish, you get a headache, you get tired, and so on. The temptation is, and I must mention that at this point, is to take something like paracetamol or acetaminophen to try to control that fever. That's actually not the right thing to do. That fever is there as part of the immune defense system. So provided it doesn't get out of control, in which case we do intervene, we just rest, let that fever take its course, put up with a headache, because if you try to suppress that fever, you're actually suppressing the immune system's natural defenses. So once the immune system has then detected that it's got control of the virus, the next most important thing is to shut that down. And that step, I think, is being overlooked in a lot of the discussions that I'm hearing at the moment, because you don't want to stop that inflammatory or that assault process too early, but you do need to shut it down so that you stop the collateral damage. And when we're hearing about people going into the worst of the crisis of the COVID-19 infection, those processes are not being shut down. So it may be that the virus hasn't been sufficiently controlled at that point, or it may be that the immune system is not sufficiently fine-tuned, that it says, okay, you've done your job, back off military, go back in your corner, we're fine, and now we will start the recovery process. And there's a lot of recovery that has to take place then, but we'll go into that in a later episode.
Very good. So why would you say this current viral infection is creating more concern and more challenges than, say, bacterium infection?
Well, bacteria we're quite accustomed to. You know, it's about 100 years ago that penicillin was discovered, and that was the first of the antibiotics. And so we got used to the idea that you can have a bacterial infection. Most of us don't know whether we do or we don't, but we're in the habit of going to the GP. If we have some sort of an infection, he or she may or may not give us an antibiotic, but we're quite used to the fact that that antibiotic kills whatever it was, and we go back and we live happily ever after. The problem with the viral infection is it's a different creature altogether, and we have no drugs apart from a few specific antivirals for diseases like HIV and herpes and a couple of other things. We have no antiviral drugs which are the equivalent of an antibiotic. So we are very reliant on our innate immune system. That's the built-in system that we've had since the beginning of time. We're reliant on a healthy immune system in most cases to deal with those infections. After all, that's how you get over the common cold. Your own immune system kicks in. You feel pretty miserable for a few days or a week or even 2 weeks if it's a bad one, and then everything settles down. But we just don't have those drugs. So the discussion at the moment in medical circles is to look at using a vaccine. And a vaccine then is kind of like you've got to the end of your own recovery process, and the vaccine now is like doing the job that the advanced part of your immune system would do. But there's few problems with that, apart from the fact that we don't have one at this point. But viruses mutate fairly quickly. And you've only got to get a subtle change in the genetics of the virus that the vaccine no longer is appropriate to deal with that mutated, slightly modified strain of the virus. That's why every year there's a different flu vaccine, because there's a different strain of the flu. So
It's interesting too with that, Christine, because they're saying that even those that have contracted and gotten through an infection with COVID-19, they're not even sure if that, whether that they may even get a second infection. So yeah, I think, putting our faith in the development of a
Yes.
it could be a bit wasted there. So what have we learnt, over the last 3 to 6 months since it's been called a pandemic? What have they learnt about this particular virus and what's going on there?
I've had my head deep into the research and over that period of time, and what I've discovered to a large extent is a lot of what we need to know now was actually known back in SARS-1 in 2002. There's some extremely useful research in there, given that somewhere between 80 and 90% of the genetics of the SARS-1 virus is the same as the SARS-2 virus that we're dealing with now. So a large body of that research is now very valuable for interpretation now. So there are some differences, but there's more the same than there is different. And a lot of the mechanisms that I've learned about in this period of time, some of which I'm going to share shortly, are absolutely fascinating, and we need to understand these mechanisms if we've got an even half chance of knowing what we can do to give our own immune systems just a little bit of a helping hand to deal with this insidious threat. Interestingly too, back then, there were a couple of drugs developed which are mimicking some of the mechanisms of nature. And I've subsequently discovered that there are actually readily available plant extracts or plant molecules that can be used to mimic these processes of nature. The problem with the drugs is they abandoned them anyway because they weren't specific enough for the virus. They had some other adverse effects which really made them unusable, although some of them were being really developed for cancer at the time, and in particular prostate cancer. So don't need to dig into that now, but it does give some wonderful background to understanding now how we can deal with this, and really reinforcing the fact that there's no way a single vitamin, no matter what it is, has any opportunity of addressing the multiple complexities that the interaction between this virus and our own immune system brings.
So, well, given that, Christine, how does it wreak such incredible havoc, in the body, this small little microorganism?
Yes, well, it's interesting, and it's very clever, this virus. And as with any virus, it's not even a complete cell. It can't reproduce itself without the help of a mammalian cell like a human cell. And I probably need to share a couple of slides with you to just explain this further. But before I do, the interesting thing about a virus is it has to hijack our cells in order to reproduce itself. We reproduce our cells by using DNA and a complex machinery that enables us to replicate our cells. The virus has just RNA, it doesn't have DNA. It hijacks our cells and goes, right, we're in here, you're going to replicate us. So you kind of held at ransom your own cells. And so we start producing enormous quantities of the virus in our own cells. Sometimes the virus kills our cell in the process, sometimes we contain it, but essentially that's how the virus spreads. So let me just give you some more detail by sharing a couple of slides. Okay. So first thing to understand is, how does the virus actually get into the cell? So here's a coronavirus. Probably everybody's familiar with this idea of the virus with the little spike proteins around the outside. And this is just the RNA inside. So that's as much genetic material as it has. So when it's in contact with a cell membrane, we're only going to talk about humans here, but it's the same in a lot of other animals, including bats, which have been discussed in this context. So on our cells, we have this, it's like a docking station. It's an ACE2 receptor. And these spikes have a particular affinity for the ACE2 receptor. They attach there, And that's step one as to how they actually get into the cell. Now, I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are familiar with the concept of the ACE2 receptor being necessary, but there's a backstory, and we aren't being told the backstory. And the backstory is this: if the virus just docks onto ACE2 and nothing else, it just stays docked onto ACE2 until it diminishes. What it needs is the assistance of an enzyme called a protease inside our cell. And what the protease does, so protease is just an enzyme that breaks down a protein. And so here we have now the protease is now breaking down part of the protein in the cell membrane of the host, us, and it's also breaking into the spike of the virus. What actually happens is the spike gets broken, the ACE2 receptor gets broken, and now the membrane of the virus and the membrane of the human cell fuse together, and that's how the virus actually now gets into the cell.
That's incredible. So it's almost melting away our cell wall and its cell wall, just so they all come together.
It is like that. Now, a couple of other things are useful to know here. So now we've broken up the ACE2 receptor, and as we'll see a little bit later on, that is highly damaging in its own right, because the ACE2 receptor is part of our own defense system. So we need to keep our ACE2 receptors, like they are over here, intact. So now, as you say, it melts into the cell itself, and you'd go, well, why on earth would Mother Nature put this protease, this TMPRSS2, which stands for transmembrane protease serine? Doesn't matter, except to notice that it's transmembrane. So that bit's
I think you get a few extra points though for remembering all of that.
And you go, why does nature put that in the membrane? Well, the answer to that is that we don't exactly know yet, except that there's another part to the story. And the other part to the story is this protease has also a naturally occurring antiprotease, and this secretory leukocyte protease inhibitor, we'll just call it SLPI, shall we? It naturally blocks the protease. So built in here in the mechanism is this regulatory step already, and lots of places in nature we have these regulatory steps where you have this seesaw kind of an effect where when something has one effect, there's another molecule that has the opposite effect. So we keep the regulation. It's what we call in science homeostasis or balance. Nature always tries to keep balance. So if the immune system is working well, the SLPI comes in and goes, not so fast, protease. You can't do that. Just leave all this alone. And so essentially then you end up with your intact ACE2 receptor. Now, is that one of the ways that some people manage to escape the infection? Possibly, but the studies haven't been done yet to really confirm that. But it's a very likely mechanism. So that's the antiprotease. The other thing that is really exciting to me, because I'm very interested in Nrf2 chemistry, which we'll discuss in episode 2, but if you can activate Nrf2, you can actually activate this antiprotease, so you manage to keep the balance. And so there is a large array of plant-derived potent Nrf2 activators that we can use to activate the antiprotease to keep this balance. So
it gets back again to a diet high in vegetables and plant food. That so people that are eating these sorts of foods are going to be much better off and have these this mechanism. Plus, I know we're going to be talking about a host of others that you know are activated through this sort of approach. The right sorts of foods.
Absolutely. And when I hear commentary from perhaps pharmaceutical sources that say it doesn't really matter about what you eat, I am just really enraged by this, because this is a powerful, powerful message and it's being missed. But anyway, let's come back to that later, because what I want to just talk about is why is ACE2 so critical? So, and I don't want to go into too much biochemistry here, But there will be people who take ACE inhibitors as drugs to control their blood pressure. So this is ACE1. We're actually interested in ACE2. So what happens is angiotensin 2, which is what these blood pressure drugs block, it's a bit of a nasty, and it causes vasoconstriction, that's narrowing of your blood vessels. It causes inflammation, causes oxidative stress, which is like free radical attack, if you like, and it causes fibrosis or thickening of vessels. So this is a bit of a bad guy. ACE2 over here is the good guy. So it does the opposite. It produces vasodilation, it's anti-inflammatory, and it stops scarring. So you see there the value of ACE2 and the value of keeping it intact, as we discussed over here. So the minute you have this virus entering the cell, what you're doing by knocking off ACE2 is you are losing the benefit of all of these protective mechanisms over here, and you're really allowing these mechanisms here to be the major threat. So what can we do with that? A little piece of information is we say, this is one of the older papers that looks at SARS-CoV. This is 2002 version, and it shows that SARS-CoV-1 actually ramps up angiotensin 2 and blocks ACE2, and now we have SARS-CoV-2 doing exactly the same thing. So this is one of these examples of that wonderful old research, which is now pretty much identical to what's happening now with the SARS-2 that we're dealing with at the moment.
So in essence, Christine, the virus is not just using the ACE2 mechanism, hijacking that to get into the cells, it's dismantling it, so which is then ramping up the angiotensin 2 and all the blood pressure and the oxidative stress, which the immune system itself is doing in response as well. So it's making this much, much worse. And this is insidious. So obviously this is putting a huge challenge on the tissue within the lungs. What other parts of the body are being affected by this virus?
Well, that was one of the interesting things that I went hunting for answers to, because we've seen now that the kidneys are very much involved in these later stage COVID-19 reactions. The heart, the testes now, there's concern there. And I'm going to come in a moment to another section where these ACE2 receptors are actually on the wall of our red blood cells, and that's very significant when we talk about that in a moment. But in the respiratory system, the ACE2 receptors are actually greater in the nasal passages, in particular the nasal goblet cells that produce the mucus, very active throughout that whole initial nasal endpoint where the virus enters the body, but also in the mouth. And the tongue in particular is very rich in ACE2 receptors. So what that means is the major entry points of the virus into the system, the nasal passages and the mouth, are there, sitting there waiting with lots of these ACE2 receptors ready to fire.
Do you think, and I know this is a bit of a side, but you know, one of the early symptoms of COVID-19 infection is a loss of the sense of taste. And do you think this is perhaps because these ACE2 receptors are being dismantled and all this inflammation?
I don't know, but it's interesting to speculate, isn't it? And yeah. I think that too, and it's probably quite likely. The other area I haven't mentioned is the gut. The entire gut lining is very rich in ACE2 receptors, as are the lining cells of the blood vessels throughout the body. So any of the lining cells of the body, and they're just single layer of cells, they are all very rich in ACE2 receptor. Now, the other thing I can't not mention is people who are smokers, long-term cigarette smokers, have a multiplication of ACE2 receptors in all of these areas. So if their protease, anti-protease balance was intact, they'd be fine, but it's probably not, because smoking is dismantling a whole lot of other defense processes as well.
So basically, it's increasing the amount of entry points available for this virus if you're a smoker.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And somebody in a paper that I was reading had said that Chinese men in the early stages of this year were very prone to the virus, and in China more men smoke than women, and many people in China smoke. So it was just one of those speculative comments that said, I wonder if the fact that there's such a prevalence of smoking in Chinese men that would explain why they're more exposed. So let's just move on to one of the other mechanisms that's involved here. So I mentioned earlier that the ACE2 receptors are also found on the outside of the red blood cells. And we're just going to have a look at how CoV-2 attacks hemoglobin. So a hemoglobin molecule is a chain of proteins, but in the center of it is a heme group. And all we need to know about that is that in the middle of this great cluster of protein, we have iron, and it's the iron part of the heme that carries oxygen, and that's absolutely essential. So when we breathe in, we're attaching oxygen to these heme molecules, and that oxygen is now particularly associated with iron. So this is why people who are anemic, who have low iron, don't have it and get tired a lot because they're not carrying enough oxygen, and oxygen is necessary in all cells to produce energy. So the problem here is that CoV-2 attacks one of these protein chains and it dismantles the hemoglobin molecule, and that means now that we're going to have less oxygen going into the lungs. So of course we know people getting breathless with this disease. So you
mean less oxygen in the lungs getting into the blood?
Getting into the blood to travel to every cell in the body, yes.
Yeah, okay.
So here we've got a hemoglobin molecule, and here's our little virus. So what's actually happening is the hemoglobin molecule starts to break apart under the influence of the virus. It does a couple of things. So we've mentioned oxygen starvation, but the other thing which is really important is now the iron that was locked up in the hemoglobin is now released, and it's free iron. And free iron is a highly toxic species, and the body has a number of ways of locking it up so it can do its useful things without causing damage. But in this case now it's let free. It's now causing reactive oxygen species to be produced in large quantities, otherwise known as free radicals. And those reactive oxygen species keep switching in a circular loop between inflammatory cytokines, which is part of the inflammatory process of the cell, and back and forth between each other. The effect of that is major lung damage and scarring, and obviously the inability to breathe. So we've got two things going on here that are causing the problem. Not enough oxygen to feed the blood, to feed the cells, to cause energy, and free iron that's absolutely creating havoc all over the place. And part of this phenomenon we call the cytokine storm is partly fed by this process. So there's another factor now that we must take into account. And we've talked about the reactive oxygen species, or the free radicals. And look, I don't like to call them free radicals as a scientist because it's not a technical term, but just please understand ROS, reactive oxygen species, and free radicals are one and the same thing.
With that, Christine, too, this increased stress on not just the lungs, but it's going to be upon the whole body, the liver, the brain, everywhere, this increase in this oxidative burden, if you like.
Yes, that's true. And also the reduction in energy production in the cells. So we feel tired when we don't produce enough energy, but most cells are reliant on energy to produce consistently right throughout the day and the night. And so we lose that ability to produce the energy that drives all of these essential processes in cells. So You can see we're getting hit from many directions with this disease. So
this is why we see their O2 levels going down too, as people get the virus, and without them being necessarily breathless, because they're not recognising it.
Yes, so those oxygen levels are measurably reduced over time before even people feel breathless. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that while we're taking oxygen in from the lungs into the blood vessels, we're also diffusing carbon dioxide out. So I won't go into the detail of that, but the way it works, people are not registering that they can't breathe properly, but they're breathing faster and more shallowly to get that oxygen in, and often not realising that's what they're doing until it just completely gets overwhelmed. So you may have heard that some of the groups who are most susceptible to this infection or to the consequences of the infection are type 2 diabetics, and you might wonder why that is. The situation is not just for people with full-blown diabetes, but it's for people who have disordered glucose metabolism anyway. So they're tending to have spikes of glucose. I mean, you could go and sit on the couch and eat a bag of lollies right now and spike your glucose pretty quickly. As soon as you do that, those elevated levels of glucose activate the free radical effect again. This is exactly the same diagram we saw before. It's just another way of increasing these reactive oxygen species and the inflammatory cytokines. And it's likely that people who have an elevated HbA1c, so anyone who's diabetic will know they have their A1c levels elevated, or HbA1c, same thing. And that's where glucose gets itself attached to the hemoglobin molecule and it becomes oxidative. So there are many processes going on here that are contributing to the decline. And I might just leave this one just for the moment. Did we want to talk about the cytokine storm right now?
Well, I think so, Christine, and particularly in other people that are at risk. We see that type 2 diabetics are at greater risk. You know, what other sort of individuals are going to be at risk there too?
So anybody with a glucose disorder. Now, 50% of type 2 diabetics in the population don't know they're yet diabetic. I'm going to say that again because it's a really startling phenomenon. 50% of the population, typically those who are overweight, have type 2 diabetes, but it's not yet been diagnosed. So that's important to know. And if anyone who's very overweight is watching what we're talking about and taking it in, please, I urge you to look at your diet now. You don't have to suddenly be slim and trim, but even losing 10% of your existing body weight or body fat stores will reduce your risk of type 2 diabetes very significantly. But let's get on with this. So here's our now recognisable SARS-CoV-2 virus, and we've got a healthy pair of lungs here. So what the virus is doing is, we've already seen we are producing lots of reactive oxygen species, and we've got this feedback loop where they're converting backwards and forwards through inflammatory cytokines, or I shouldn't say converting, but one is reacting on the other. So here's our reactive oxygen species. Here's our cytokines. We know we're going to get lung damage from that. What does the body do in response? So firstly, it'll go and try to recruit more immune cells because it's going, gee, we're not really solving this problem here. There's still too many inflammatory cytokines, too many reactive oxygen species, lungs are getting damaged, I need to do more. So both of those increases will signal the movement of more immune cells to the area. So here's blood vessel. It's got mostly red blood cells in there, and it's got some white blood cells in there. Now it's got lots of white blood cells that are being recruited out of the blood vessels into the area in an attempt to try to control that process and now mount a larger attack. But in the process, of course, we're going to cause more inflammation, which has the risk of producing more collateral damage. The other thing that's really important here, and partly answers one of your earlier questions on other parts of the body that are affected, is that these cytokines circulate through the blood vessels, and as they're going through the circulation, they now are travelling to other parts of the body and affecting other organs. And so inflammation can now occur in tissues quite distant from the nasal passages, the tongue or the lungs, where all of this process began.
So they're starving the tissue of oxygen for the tissue to function and normally and defend itself. And then they're increasing this storm of inflammation and oxidative burden there as well.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I just found this diagram, well, it's not even officially published yet, June the 2nd, 2020. And it's basically looking at the correlation between blood sugar levels and the reactive oxygen species and its effect in COVID-19. So essentially they're saying 98.9% of COVID-19 patients survive. And we need to remember this. I'm giving you a horror story of all of the things that it can do, but not that many people are actually dying from the disease. Most people recover. And those who are dying usually already have other risks, which we'll talk about shortly. So it's the poorly controlled blood glucose patients here, they're saying, is likely to put them at risk. And here we can see you eat that kind of food, you're going to promote metabolic dysfunction, blood sugar disorders, ultimately type 2 diabetes, and you eat this kind of food, and you're probably not.
Isn't it interesting too, because even with the economic implication of this and people perhaps having less money, we find that these very, very unhealthy foods can be cheap as chips for people to buy, and it's just creating more and more of an issue for them. More of a
They're often cheap and chips, actually.
Yeah, that's right. Super size me. Yeah. So, Christine, who then are the other groups that are most at risk here, or that's a greater risk for this infection?
Well, and I think it's been said in the media as well that those elderly people are at risk. And as we know, all of our protective systems tend to diminish as we get older. So nothing works quite as efficiently as it does when we age. That doesn't mean that we can't recover, and that's why once we look in episode 2 at the systems that our cells use to protect themselves, we have ways of ramping up those protective processes because some people, well, we all have different genetics specifically. We have things called polymorphisms or SNPs, which just means subtle differences in the efficiency of the way our cells behave. They're not genetic diseases, but they are just little genetic weaknesses. Luckily, as we'll see in episodes 2 and 3, there are ways we can take advantage of the protective effects as we understand them, and we can tend to build out the weaknesses that are being produced by those SNPs. So
does that help, Christine, explain why? Because that's another one of the puzzling things. People who are dying from this, and they put them on ventilators and they get worse, and yet others are tested and they're positive and they have just very few symptoms, or they're asymptomatic.
Well, probably all of the things that I mentioned so far as protective are going to be working more efficiently in the people who escape it. And, I hear this term that there are people in the community who are super spreaders, as if that's a bad thing, and you nasty, nasty people, you're spreading this disease to others. They're the people who have the natural immunity. Their defences are working beautifully. They could have truckloads of virus sitting on their ACE2 receptors, but the body's going, you don't come in here. And they've got all these viruses present and they're doing nothing. That's the optimum situation. So the younger you are and the better your lifestyle, the more likely you are to be in that category. And the fact that super spreader is being said in a negative context is really not right, because they're the people we want to be protected. we talk about, and I think you just mentioned it, elderly people being more prone to this, and reacting to the effect of the ventilators. The ventilators are pumping concentrated oxygen into a tissue which now can't use that oxygen. So a lot of the hemoglobin, not all of it obviously, but a lot of the hemoglobin is being chopped up into useless pieces. And it can't, there's no hemoglobin for all this oxygen to attach to. So the oxygen in excess actually causes more reactive oxygen species. So we're actually, and I hear commentary saying we're wondering why people on ventilators sometimes die soon after going on it. I'm not wondering why, because it's well known that excessive oxygen can have this effect, in the same way that excessive oxygen on a premature baby can cause blindness. It's exactly the same mechanism, and it's known and it's well known, but it's being forgotten. So that one's very concerning. I don't think I'd want to go on a ventilator. Things about ozone and so on, we'll come back to that in episode 3, where we'll spend a little bit more time on what we can do and how it works. But I'm just setting the scene for what's the virus do. Episode 2, we're going to talk about those defences that are helping this to bounce back.
Yeah, so Christine, there's obviously a lot more about the actions of this virus at a cellular level, isn't there?
Most definitely. And to me, if I can't understand the mechanism of what the virus is doing and couple that with what I know of how human cells respond to threats, I can't work out a therapeutic strategy. But by knowing that, as I'm starting to piece together, there's lots of new pieces of this puzzle emerging, and my last 3 months being digging deeply into this research, often old research, and bringing it to the fore, tells me there's lots that we can do. And so it doesn't have to be all negative. There's lots and lots of things we can do. And I think a lot of the panic is because we're not being told that there are things you can do to protect your immune system. Mainstream medicine detests the term boosts immunity. There's no such thing as immune boosting. And as a scientist, I agree with that. But in layperson's language, boosts immunity does mean something. It's just what we're using to do it. And I think, you know, I've talked about free radicals and reactive oxygen species and inflammatory cytokines, but it's just far too simplistic to think that a molecule like vitamin C, an essential nutrient, has the power to deal with all of the things that this virus is doing. And we'll talk in episode 2 a lot about what antioxidant defense mechanisms mean in human cells. And we'll find out that vitamin C is just a very small bit player in a very large picture.
Well, fantastic, Christine. Well, look, thank you very much for that. And I can't wait for our next session, where we learn why those people who do so exceptionally well, why that, more about that, and how we can get into that group.
I can't wait either, Robert. Yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Christine.